AJU 3141, Age of Conquests, Britain from the Romans to the Normans. Today, after Rome, making sense of the fragments. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is talk about the processes that are taking place after the end of Roman Britain and the problems we have in coming to understand them. There are major social, political, and cultural changes after 400, but there's also a fundamental shift in the nature of evidence and the volume of survival, both written and archaeological, all of which means that whilst we can know a lot about Roman Britain, both on its own terms and within the broader history of the Roman Empire, when it comes to understanding what's going on in the period between 400 and 600, our sources are much reduced and in many ways highly problematic. Making sense of the fragments, then, is a major challenge. As we'll see shortly, one of the things that's happening in this period is the arrival of numerous incoming peoples from continental Europe, but also from Ireland. So this is a time of motility and transformation, which explains why the previous slide had something that looked very much like a medieval wooden Muppet. In fact, that Muppet is a ship's prow, a ship's figurehead, now in London, but originally found on the continent. And it's the kind of figurehead one would have seen at the prow of the many ships that are starting to beach along the eastern and southern coasts of what had once been Roman Britain in the 400s and the 500s. So it's a symbol, if you like, of the new elements that are coming in. One way to think about this period as we move into it is to imagine the lights going out in 410 or thereabouts and coming back on in 600. And then the question becomes, what's been happening in the darkness? Because when the lights come back on, this is what Britain looks like. We've got surviving areas where we can still see Britons over here, Wales, Cornwall, the southwest, and the far western zone up here, and up here into that highland zone. And again, underneath all of this, of course, there's the framework, the skeleton that we've put in place with Roman Britain. So we have on the western side surviving Celtic peoples, Brittonic peoples. But large parts of the island look fundamentally changed because we have all along the eastern seaboard and all along that lowland zone, the area that was most densely Romanized, the area that was most populous, the area that had the most villas and was connected more tightly with the Roman world beyond. Well, we've got new players. We've got kingdoms in Kent. We've got settlements here. We've got distinctive emerging polities, South Saxons, West Saxons, Middle and East, denoting areas of settlement by continental incomers. And we've got people such as the Huicha, which is a name for an ethnic group that also seems to derive originally from the continent, and they're occupying this territory along here. We've got the East Angles, and we've also got Mercians. Mercia is the name of a place, and it takes its name from the word for march or frontier. And this map also gives you a sense of why an identity defined by frontier might be relevant, because it's the very meeting point of east and west, if you like, these two settlement zones. And if we follow this map up, we've also got settlements by the Angles all the way up, and kingdoms here, a new kingdom, Lindsey, Deira, and Bernicia, which together fuse to form the Kingdom of Northumbria. So all the way up to the areas that the Romans had at various points conquered and fortified. But we've not simply got remains of the people who were there perhaps before, during, and now after the Roman phase of British history, because we've also got new kingdoms. We've got the Kingdom of Strathclyde up here, which is linked across the Irish Sea to polities in Ireland. So when the lights go on in 600, we've got a complex political map. But we've also got a world that's almost unrecognizable from a map of Roman Britain. In short, there have been major transformations. What's been going on? Perhaps one of the first things to say is that the transformations that are happening in Britain are also being paralleled in some, but not always, by what's been going on the continent. And this is a familiar map with its vigorous display of arrows showing the movements of non-Romans into the Roman world. But as we move into the period after 400 and then after 500, Europe's looking very different. This is what things looked like around about 480, so the last decade, 2 decades of the 5th century. As you can see, the Roman Empire's still there, but it's been cut in half, bisected. And its capital, no longer Rome, but Constantinople. So the Eastern Empire has survived, and the Western one, well, it's gone. We've got a North African kingdom, the kingdom of the Vandals. We've also got a kingdom of the Burgundians, one of the many incoming peoples, the Alemanni, who the Romans have been fighting with for centuries, the Franks as well, and also elements of independent, formerly Roman territories in which provincial Roman elites have taken power for themselves. After all, if there's no central power, then things devolve upon you. So we have this kingdom of Syagrius, a Roman, post-Roman, Roman kingdom. And then down here in what's now southern France, and then across the Pyrenees into Spain, the Visigothic kingdom, the kingdom of the Suebi. So we have a multiplicity of emergent political units in which non-Roman groups have become dominant. In that sense, what's going on in the eastern and lowland zones of Britain can be placed in this broader context of a formative period of post-Roman and sub-Roman political groups. This map focuses in with greater clarity upon the northwestern component of that previous map. And it's helpful for us because it highlights the particular peoples and polities of northwestern Europe. We have the Ostrogothic kingdom here, Burgundy's down here. You can see parts of the Visigothic kingdom, but also an expanded Frankish kingdom as we move into the early 6th century. I'll be revisiting some of these places where relevant as we move forward. It's also helpful for us because it gives us an indication of what might be called the homelands from which some of the incomers who during these centuries will be establishing new communities where they're coming from. So the East Saxons, South Saxons, West Saxons, well, this is the area that will be known as the lands of the Old Saxons. This map's important because it reminds us of one crucial issue, which is as that telephone call reminded me that even though we're dealing with a very changed world in Western post-Roman Europe, nevertheless, we're still dealing with a relationship between what's going on in the island of Britain and what's going on the continent. But now it's no longer a Roman conversation. It's a question of interaction between the peoples here, Brittonic and incomer, and those who've established themselves over here, not least for our purposes, the Franks. And if there's one last area we need to think about, and this map will help us do it, it's down here. It's Rome. No longer a political center, or at least not a political center in the way it had been for previous centuries. After all, the empire survives in the east, and its center is now Constantinople. But Rome is still a center of authority, religious authority, papal authority. And how Rome deals with the Franks, but more particularly deals with this world here, is something we'll be looking at in due course. So it's a different world, but it's still in significant ways a connected one. So let's begin with a very basic question. What are the written sources for understanding what's happening in Britain after 400? And the answer is there aren't many of them, and the ones we do have are problematic. So what follows is a relatively detailed discussion, and in many cases dismissal of the sources that seem to speak or claim to speak of this period. I'm going to go through them because it's important that we get a sense of quite what exists and then figure out quite what we can do with it. So what follows is going to be quite detailed, but is, I think, necessary. We've already touched a little bit upon the nature of sources in this course. If you think of Tacitus and the way he presented Rome's enemies as ways to offer criticism of Rome as a whole, or those tablets from Vindolanda with their brief windows upon the rhythms of the private lives and personal concerns of the Romans on the far northern frontier. But when we come to the world after 400, it's important to really foreground the written sources that we have, not least to have an understanding of what they can tell us and what they can't tell us, and also how we have to be cautious about them. In other words, at this point, we're not simply interested in what happened, we're also interested in how we can find out about what happened, and if you like, the kind of weight we can place upon individual texts. Perhaps the easiest way to organize these sources is by thinking about them in terms of distance in time from the events that they're reporting or notionally presenting. How far after the events of the 400s or 500s is the text being written? And then we can also think about a different kind of distance. We can think about geographic distance. How far away is the person actually committing an account of what's going on in post-Roman Britain to writing? And does that in some ways vitiate the value of the source? So these are basic but effective critical tools, and self-evident ones in many ways, except for this qualifier, which is that we have to remember that in this world, a world of late antiquity, a world of early medieval culture, it's not only probable, it's almost certainly the case that many early sources, say a source written in 500 or 600, exists not in a contemporary copy, i.e. the text we have may have been written at this point, but the actual document, the manuscript itself, was written at the same time. In fact, what we see is texts that are written in 400, 500, 600, wherever, may only exist in much later copies. So the manuscript, the handwritten copy, taken from an earlier copy, which in turn may have come from an earlier copy, all of which have been lost through the vagaries of time, it means that we might only have a 12th or 13th century manuscript when we have to figure out whether the text in there is from the 13th century and is only fallaciously claiming to be an actual document from the period, or whether in fact what we have in this document, in this manuscript, is a genuine early source. And that can be highly problematic. But to give you an illustration of that, some of the key texts we have from Tacitus, who's writing at a time when the Roman Empire is still in its fullest form, some of the earliest manuscripts of Tacitus's key works are 9th century, the better part of 800 years after he was writing. So there's a lag. There are various problems when we deal with written sources in this period, but distance between composition and the consignment to the written page is one of them. Anyway, enough of the methodological perspective. What have we got? Well, when we sit down and try and figure out what the bibliography for understanding this period is, we discover that we've got a range of sources, but each of which, for the most part, has problems. We've got later insular sources, and by insular I'm talking about texts that are emerging from the island of Britain, and that could be from the Brittonic world, from the Western world, or from the areas of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutish settlements. So we have the Annales Cambriae, so-called Welsh annals. But here we have a source that seems to tell us about what's going on in the period of the 400s and 500s, but there are problems. The problem is that the first edition of it, the first compilation, seems to be from the 10th century, and the first manuscript is even later. So that compilation in the mid-10th century may carry within it and certainly addresses early history, but it's very hard to see how accurate these sources are and how close they are to the events on the ground. And the earliest elements to it seem to be written circa 700 anyway. So what looks like a useful source initially suddenly becomes less useful when we realize that it's still, even if we excavate the text down to the barest level, it's still several hundred years after the events it talks about, which is a shame because the Annales Cambriae has lots to tell us about the battle between the incoming Germanic-speaking peoples from the continent and the Romano-British, but it has to be put to one side. We've got a series of documents that claim to be documents of landholding, the Landgraf Charters. But again, they're supposedly speaking about this period from 400 onwards, but they only survive in later copies, and we don't have enough contemporary texts from the same place to get a sense of whether they're actually useful or not, or even whether they're genuinely reflecting what's going on at the time, or whether they're a back projection. The Middle Ages is full of fraudulent texts and documents that claim ownership or make statements about power that don't really have any bearing. There's a lot of back projection for very immediate personal advantage or institutional advantage. So the sources that, up until the earlier part of the 20th century, historians would conventionally use to construct rather detailed narratives of these centuries are, in the 21st century, seen as, if not quite toxic, certainly unhelpful and duplicitous. The third insular source, later insular source, is a text known as the Historia Brittonum, the history of Britons, sometimes ascribed to an author called Nennius. It's now not clear whether Nennius ever existed, and if he did, whether he actually wrote the text known as the Historia Brittonum. But what is clear is this. The text itself is written in the 820s. In other words, it's a 9th century text. And it's back projecting into this period after the end of Roman Britain in order to construct political narratives that are useful to the realities of the 9th century. So all told, these later insular sources, all emerging from the Brittonic Latin cultures of early medieval Britain, are less helpful than they superficially appear. So we can cross them out and perhaps wisely tune out what they have to say, despite the fact that at various points we find references to the figure who's most closely associated with these Dark Age centuries, the mythical figure of King Arthur. And while we're consigning later works that back project certain things upon this period and use them for their own immediate contemporary purposes, we should probably dismiss as well the text at the bottom of this page, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Geoffrey's History of the Kings of Britain. He's a 12th century historian, though to call him historian is perhaps to stress the term historian to its utter limits, because what he wrote is a fantastical sort of Marvel universe account of this period. It's Geoffrey of Monmouth who's one of the main figures to present us not only with King Arthur during these dark centuries, but also the figure of Merlin. And it's Geoffrey's narrative that will be embroidered and built upon by successive generations of literary figures. For our purposes, Geoffrey shows the enduring interest in these centuries, but he gives us nothing of any real and tangible value, so we can scrub him out. Which means we're left with the texts in the middle, which are Gallic and Frankish sources, which is to say they're texts produced broadly contemporaneously with the events we're interested in, but produced on the other side of the Channel, produced in the former provinces of Gaul as it morphs slowly and violently into an early Frankish kingdom. So we have Constantius, I'm going to talk about in due course, Prosper, and these somewhat tersely named chronicles, the Chronicle of 452, 511. I'm going to ignore Frigeridus because that's of actually no great import for us, and just look at one or two of these Gallic, Frankish contemporary sources, just to get a sense of what we can know and what the surviving archive tells us of these darkest of centuries. When we consider how momentous the events of these years are, the terseness and the brevity of these entries is really quite remarkable. The Gallic chronicler is interested in what's going on in Gaul, unsurprisingly. And when it comes to Britain, the primary focus falls upon the emergence of two sequential usurpers, figures acclaimed by their army in Britain, who will then eventually move their armies out of the island, take them to the continent as part of their own political enterprises. The first is Magnus Maximus, who in 383 is acclaimed by his troops as emperor, and who has to face, prior to leaving the island of Britain, a major attack, as you can see in 384, by Picts and Scots, i.e. peoples from north of the frontier coming down. So part and parcel of a political enterprise is still defending Britain, as it had been at various points in Romano-British history for centuries. By 386, however, seemingly with the initial threat, or the seeming threat of the Picts and Scots behind him, Magnus Maximus crosses over to Gaul and takes on the pre-existing imperial structure, namely the figure of the Emperor Gratian. For our purposes, 409, 410 is the next entry that is of relevance to us. It reads, in the 16th year of Honorius, in this storm, the forces of the Romans were stretched thin to their foundations beyond their strength. The British lands were devastated by an incursion of the Saxons, and the Vandals and Alans lay waste part of the Gallic lands. So after the attacks of the 380s, the mid-380s, we now have, according to the Gallic Chronicler, a second wave, but a wave that's coming from the east, that's coming from the Saxon territory. So people who are not part of that, those complex skeins of Romano-British island political history. The next usurper to emerge after the death of Magnus Maximus is the confusingly named Constantine, not to be confused with Constantine I of the early 4th century, to whom he is not in any way related whatsoever, but it's a name that has an association and a certain glamour. This is Constantine III. He's also acclaimed by his army, and he also sets out on a ambitious political mission to establish himself as an emperor. It doesn't go well for him. As you can see, in 411 he's killed. By the time we reach 442 in this brief set of annals, and I've of course erased the ones in the intervening periods that aren't relevant to us, we have a final statement from the Gallic Chronicler that gives us a final nugget of information with which we can try and reconstruct what's going on in this chaotic period. In the 18th year of the reign of Theodosius II, that long-lived, long-reigned Eastern emperor, the British lands up to this time, lacerated with various disasters and events, was subjugated under the rule of the Saxons. So for the Gallic Chronicler, the narrative is, by the last half, the end of the first half of the 5th century, the Saxons had managed to take control of British territory. Well, the first thing we can say is that the other Gallic chronicler, the one from 511, corroborates that last historical statement. 440, in the 16th year of Theodosius II, the British lands lost by the Romans came under the rule of the Saxons. So, seemingly independent corroboration that the Gallic perspective was that by the early 440s, Roman Britain was no more, and it was now under the commands of the Saxons. As perhaps might be apparent by this stage, the sources we do have that are broadly contemporaneous with events and relatively close to them as well have a greater interest in the broader narrative of Roman political history than they do the specific events that are taking place in Roman Britain. After all, these are being written in 5th and early 6th century Gaul, when its own domestic history is being changed and its own political form is developing radically. So there's not a great deal of interest in the actual day-to-day events of Roman Britain. And Prosper shows us this. Again, it's Magnus Maximus. It's the role of Britain as a springboard for political ambition. In other words, to the mind of Prosper, Britain is still playing the same kind of role in Roman politics that it had played 150, 200, 250 years before. Not very helpful for us. That said, perhaps the thing we can take forward from this account and one or two others is that these usurpers are seen as leaving Britain and taking with them substantial military forces who've put them in power and continue to support them. So the central basic fact is that the mobile legions are being removed. So whilst informative to a degree, the total volume of information provided by these contemporary continental sources would probably not exceed about 750 words in total. What about other texts? Well, at the top we have Anglo-Saxon sources that are coming from the world of the incomers or their descendants, because as you can see we have Bede, who we've already encountered, but Bede's writing in the early 8th century. We've got an Anglo-Saxon chronicle. That's a text that's going to be produced at the end of the 9th century at the court of Alfred the Great. And when the author or authors of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle look to the past and look to this period, they go to Bede for their sources, translating his Latin into their Old English. And Bede, in turn, has, for the most part, relied upon one of the very few British sources that we have for this period that actually emerge from the darkness. And that's Gildas writing the De Excidio Britanniae. And I'm going to come back to Gildas in a minute. So The English sources, the Anglo-Saxon sources, are drawing upon earlier reports and really adding nothing to the earlier reports. We can throw them away, or at least see them as unhelpful. So we're left with the British sources, and I'm going to come to them in a second, but also a number of outlying sources that are written very far from the main events of Roman Britain, written in the Byzantine world. Well, let me back up my assertions with some evidence and show rather than simply tell. This is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, part of it. What we have are two columns. There are different subsets, different families of this text. It exists in a number of variants. There's a common element to all of them, but there's also idiosyncrasies and differences. We don't need to go into that at this point. What we do need to do is just recognize that we've got the same kind of core events split on the left and right-hand side of the page. And you get a very strong sense of just how little writing in the 9th century the historians who produced this text knew about the period under study, and also how much of it seems to derive from Bede. So we have a very terse set of entries. So the basic take-home might be that even in the late 9th century, when someone tried to understand this period, they had very, very few documents or resources to work from. Which means that when we ask ourselves what we get from these later sources, the answer is well, again, the answer is not very much. We can get every piece of information that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle provides for this period on a single page, from 381 to 449, a considerable length of time, but it warrants a very sparse set of entries. And here are the entries that speak directly to our subject today. So we have this reference to Maximus, a familiar one now, and his various ambitions, and also a reference to the heresy of Pelagius, which is something that is referenced in the life of St. Germanus. So there's intertextual connection and support. 410 is an interesting entry here because Rome is destroyed by the Goths. Well, it wasn't, but never mind. Then after that, the kings of the Romans no longer reigned in Britain. It's an interesting bringing together, derived from Bede, of what was perceived to be an axial moment in the fall of Rome, and as Rome falls, so too does Roman Britain. So it's connecting provincial history to the main rhythms of Rome itself. And then one or two other entries. In this year, the Romans collected all the treasures which were in Britain, hid some in the ground, and we'll look at some of the ones that have been found subsequently, and took some with them into Gaul. So a sense of dispersal and evacuation on the part of those who could. And then 446, if we remember, just a few years after some of those earlier Gallic sources are seeing Roman Britain under the control of the Saxons. And this year the Britons sent across the sea to Rome and asked for help against the Picts, but got none, for the Romans were engaged in a campaign against the Huns. And then they sent to the Angles and made the same request of the chieftains of the English. So it's a different narrative. It's not endgame by 440. It's rather the beginning of the final phase, in which the failure of the Roman central authority to send troops and assistance leads to the decision on the part of what remains of the Romano-British elites, that if they can't get help from Rome, they'll hire people from the kingdom of the Angles, or the peoples of the Angles, to work as federate or allied troops against the northern attackers. So this is a differently shaped narrative, and it's one that we're going to see resonate in some ways with Gildas, because Gildas's text is underlying Bede's, and Bede's is underlying the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So this is a history as a Russian doll endeavor, if you like. Perhaps the final thing to note here is the mention here of Patrick. In this account, sent by the Pope to preach baptism to the Scots. In other words, as an official missionary to Ireland, and a different version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't have Patrick, but has a bishop, Palladius, being sent in 430. So conflicting narratives of the Christianization of Ireland. We'll come back to that in due course, but here it's just important to note that we have a reference to one of the authentic voices from this 5th century darkness. And here on the next slide, just a couple of extracts from some of those other sources, the sources that are produced in the Eastern Mediterranean, and perhaps understandably are a testament to the fractured nature of information flow. This is Orosius. He's writing in 417, and Orosius has things to say, but it's things to say about the two usurpers, Maximus and Constantine. What's going on in Roman Britain is secondary to what's going on in the major Roman narrative. So again, yet another example of a source that's contemporary but really doesn't have any great interest in what's happening over there in that far distant province. And then at the risk of labouring the point into the ground, here's finally Sozomen's Historia Ecclesiastica. And again, non-British observers are interested in the consequences for the empire, not really what's going on in Britain itself. In case you need a few more details and some clarifications on who precisely these two usurpers were, these last two named political operators in these narratives from the Eastern Mediterranean, well, on this slide and the next one, I've set down a few key dates. So here's Magnus Maximus, with what we know about him and his end in August 388. And the next slide has Constantine III, whose life follows, in broad terms, a comparable doomed trajectory. It's important to remember that the years of Roman Britain's death is also this period of the emergence of usurpers. So the process of disconnection and the process of disruption isn't simply something that's being generated by external attack, nor is it a case of a simple relationship between a set of provinces, the Diocese of Britain with its 4 provinces, and a notional Roman centre, because the situation in Rome is much more complex, and there's this additional element of internal political destabilization going on, all of which creates an additional fog of confusion and disconnection as we move across 400. That's probably the longest period of time we've gone without a map in this class. So here's a map, just to break things up and cleanse the palate after all that text. So this is a synthetic map that gives you a sense of what's going on in the 380s and beyond, and particularly the growing pressure and the arrival of multiple peoples into what had once been Romano-British territory. So Saxons, Picts, and Irish incomers coming across at various points. So it reminds us that beneath those terse and often difficult to construe body of material, we can nevertheless discern major changes taking place. By now, some of the challenges that historians face when they try and understand this period should be evident, and also the degree to which the problematic corpus of evidence that survives is in itself a testament to major changes in terms of connectivity, information flow, and coherence within what's rapidly becoming a post-Roman world. Well, enough of the negatives. Let's now turn to the positives. What about the sources that do seem to be contemporary, that do seem to be signals from this 5th, 6th century world? And what about these documents that are produced by individuals who are actually part of it, not writing in the Eastern Empire, very distant and very divorced from events? So in this section, I'm going to talk, first of all, a little bit more about what the evidence of the life of St. Germanus of Auxerre tells us, not simply for events, but also for something of the cultural life of 5th century Roman Britain, because we have to divorce a political narrative, a military narrative, if you want to call it that, from a cultural one. We've got different forms of Rome. We've got institutional authority, but we've also got modes of culture and being and self-identity going on. It's a complex package. Not all of it will disappear or transform at the same rate. So I'm going to start with Constantius's life of St. Germanus, and then I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about Patrick, and then look at Gildas, our 2 core sources for this very strange, changed world. The reason for Germanus' visit to Britain in the 420s was to counter an eruption of Pelagianism. In other words, people were following and espousing the theology of the figure of Pelagius. Pelagius was born in Britain, though he didn't spend much time there, but he was a theologian who advocated a rather idiosyncratic, by the terms of the age, view of salvation. Whereas someone like Augustine was very keen on stressing the need for divine grace, the divine intervention that made possible salvation. In other words, human beings couldn't do it on their own. They were too flawed, too limited, too sinful. Pelagius was rather more optimistic. It was possible, he argued, for human beings, particularly once they'd been baptized, to actually make their own path towards salvation through good works and through righteous actions. But this was countered by a number of polemical works produced across the Roman world, which in itself is a further testament to the fact that however much the Roman infrastructure is falling apart, nevertheless the structures of cultural and theological and intellectual debate are still active at this time. But Pelagius seems to have become something of a major figure and major influence upon the Christians of early 5th century Britain, which led directly to Germanus being sent in order to stamp it out. Constantius tells us that a set of emissaries arrive from Britain to point out to the bishops of Gaul, who are notionally their superiors, that Pelagianism has taken hold in the island, and they're concerned about this. They want it righted. They want heresy removed. They want the church to return to an orthodox position. There's a synod, there's a discussion as to what should be done, and the decision is made to dispatch Germanus and his companion Lupus to deal with this Pelagian outbreak. So this is happening in the 420s. It's happening at a time when administrative systems and administrative connections seem to have disappeared for the most part, but nevertheless the church has an infrastructure that seems to still be communicating. There's still a movement of peoples, and there's still, remarkably, in Constantius's text, we can see a sense of membership of a broader community. So we can set something of the image we get of the church and of the Christian communities of northwestern Europe against the political destabilization and fissile character of the political world. There's a crucial lesson lurking here, which is that when in Gaul and in other parts of the former western provinces, the apparatus of governance and administration that were part of the Roman state collapse, the church remains standing, and in certain key instances, the church steps into the void. And so Germanus and Lupus turn up in Britain, where they discover not only is there heresy afoot, there's also chaos on the ground. The Saxons and Picts had joined forces to make war upon the Britons. So they're dragged into this other conflict. As this passage makes clear, the account goes on to talk about the fact that the Britons are outnumbered, and that the confederation of Saxons from the east and Picts from the north is weighing heavily upon them. So all eyes look towards Germanus as the leader they need to face not only heretics but also external attackers. In this passage in front of you, you can also see that there's references to some of the Britons being baptized, which, if we take it at face value, strongly suggests that the Britons were not heretical Christians as much as pagans, a testament to the vibrancy of late Roman paganism in Roman Britain. But the arrival of Germanus brings them into the fold of Orthodox Christianity, the kind of narrative you might expect from a piece of hagiography written in praise and celebration of the achievements of its subject. But if we need to be cautious about the purpose of a text like this, we can at least concede the fact that it's meant to be plausible, that it's meant to contain a certain amount of verisimilitude, and that the vision we have of this post-Roman landscape is one that certainly Constantius thought his audience, his listeners and readers would find plausible, intelligible, and believable. So having baptized his army, he then leads it, taking the place of the absent generals. There are soldiers, but there doesn't seem to be anybody in charge in this account, interestingly, and goes around telling them where to go, lining them up, preparing them for battle against the considerably greater numbers of Saxons and Picts. And then when battle starts to be joined, the bishops 3 times chanted the Alleluia. And it's this act of liturgical exhortation that is the thing that routs the enemy. And as you can see, as the text continues, the cry that's begun by the priests is taken up by the army, the newly baptized army. The Alleluias echo around the mountains, causing considerable shock and awe on the part and into the hearts of the Picts and Saxons, and driving them into a panic. Some flee into the river they've just crossed and drown. Everyone throws away whatever they've got, whatever booty or weaponry they happen to have. The enemy collapses into a chaotic force, and victory is assured for the British. It's an interesting image. It's quite a powerful one. It's one that we can find parallels to in some other texts produced in Western Europe in the 5th century that take as their focus certain holy figures, usually holy men, who are stepping into the vacuum of leadership amongst the communities that are now dealing with a decentralized, collapsed Roman political system and encroaching barbarian peoples. So it's of a genre, a distinct genre, which is in itself noteworthy. So what we might take away from the life of Germanus is that there's connections and movement of peoples and ideas still between Britain and the continent, and that there's still a fairly sizable community of Christians, and there's an episcopal structure. There are bishops. So the church has some kind of order, and whatever chaos may be descending, nevertheless, the church is still trying to maintain its order in the face of that changed world. Similarly, we've got soldiers, though they don't seem to be very well led, and there can be no doubt that the Romano-British are being oppressed. But there's also the question of Pelagianism itself, which is not exactly recondite or high theology, but is significant. In other words, whilst the provinces of Britain might have spun out of the empire, nevertheless, they're still under observation in terms of their adherence to orthodoxy by members of the church. So there's still clearly quite a high-functioning theological, intellectual, ecclesiastical culture. They're still learning, there's still theology, there's still conversation going on with this broader intellectual world, all of which we can put in conversation with the political narratives we've seen. So if that's the sort of sense we get of what's going on in the 400s from this text written in Gaul in the latter part of the 5th century, what can we say if we move in even closer and look at the two authors who actually were writing on the ground? And the first St. Patrick. So the first and perhaps most surprising thing about Patrick is this. He's not actually Irish. He's Romano-British. And his relationship with Ireland begins when he's captured, taken as a slave to Ireland and made to work. And then, having escaped, then returns in order to proselytize and to spread Christianity. Or at least that's one consistent thread in the complex body of work that has grown up around his life and legacy. He's left with two works of his own, two works that can plausibly be assigned to his authorship. The first is an open letter, an epistola, which is addressed to a British chieftain, one Coroticus, and his extended, heavily armed entourage. And in the letter, Patrick attacks Coroticus for his behavior, his treatment of by kidnapping and slaughtering various newly converted Irish people to Christianity. It's an attack upon the extension of Christianity into the Irish world. Patrick's second text is a confessio, which isn't a confession in a sort of modern 21st century legal sense, an admission of guilt, so much as a testament or a statement of belief. And this is a complex and multifaceted work, one that gives us multiple quotations from Scripture, showing how Patrick's immersed in the textual world of Scripture, but which also addresses itself at various points to different distinctive groups. He talks about brothers. He talks about communities of various kinds. So there's a sense in which it's a text that's written in a way that reflects upon himself, but is moving outwards and is being presented to a number of others around him. He clearly wrote other works, but they've not survived, or only fragments of them have survived, and whether those fragments are genuine is somewhat contentious. There's also a lot of later works, lives of Patrick, and associated documents, all of which testify to his importance for the emergence of the Irish Church. But for our purposes, what matters is what Patrick has to say about life in the 5th century, his own experiences, and also not just what he says, but how he says it, and the words he chooses to use, which testifies to his learning, his Latinity, and as a result, gives us an insight into the kind of culture that's surviving in Britain in the 5th century. In short, the medium is as important as the message. Patrick tells us that he's a simple country person, though I'm not sure we can believe that at face value. His father, he says, was Calpurnius, who was a deacon, a decurion. His father was Petitus, a priest, and they lived at Banavem Tabernii, which is a site that has not been fully established. There are a number of potential candidates, some in northern Britain, others in Wales and elsewhere. It seems like northern Britain is a more likelier place to find it. So this is where he was. So there's a sense that he's part of a relict Roman culture, and also a family that has strong connections to the church. It's not unusual for priests to be married at this time, but nevertheless, we get the sense that this is a family business, and that Christianity is present in 5th century frontier world of Britain. He was seized and taken to Ireland, he tells us, because of the fact that the people of Britain didn't listen to their priests, and they didn't listen to the advice they were given as to how to be saved. In other words, it was a failure of piety that led him, along with thousands of others, as he says, to be taken away by Irish raiders. What else do we need to think about when we're thinking about Patrick's Confessio? It's also a work that justifies Patrick's decision to work as a missionary, as a proselytizer for Christianity in Ireland. And you get the sense that it's existing within a matrix in which there may be concerns or objections to his attitudes and his policies. So it's a complex text. It's one that has much to tell us overtly and implicitly if we're willing to be sensitive to how we, to what it has within it. And given the very small number of texts we do have from this period, one of the most important questions for us might be, well, having interrogated Patrick's Confessio and having come to understand it in terms of what it might reveal about him and about his ambient environment, how does it speak to the one other major text that survives from this period that speaks about life on the ground in 5th century Britain, Gildas, and Gildas's De Excidio Britanniae? But that's work for you to do in your reading and discussions this week. But before we get there, who was Gildas? And the answer is that he's the author of the most substantial single text to survive from this period from post-Roman Britain. And he's someone who will be remembered as well. There'll be a cult of Gildas. He'll become a saint and will be fated as such. But he'll also be remembered, ironically, by later Anglo-Saxon authors as a figure of importance when they themselves try and reconstruct this darkest of periods. Wulfstan, the Archbishop of York, writing during a time of Viking destruction, would look back across the long arc of the history of Britain and see in Gildas a prophet of his people, and a prophet who had lessons to teach in the 11th century when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were themselves coming under attack from another set of incomers, this time the Vikings. And it's Gildas's account that Bede uses, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle uses. In fact, it's Gildas's account of what's going on in the 5th century, or the early 6th century, that pretty much anybody, either a medieval figure or a modern historian, has grasped at when they want to make sense of the period. Like Patrick, he's left us a number of works, not always whole. There's the De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, the On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, the text we're interested in this week. But also there's a penitential in his name, which is to say, a penitential is a long list of various acts that have to be carried out, acts of contrition, in order to exculpate an individual from sins committed, a sort of legal code, but one that exists in the realm of the church, sin rather than crime and law. But it's De Excidio that we're interested in. After all, this is the longest single narrative we have from this period. It's the longest single attempt to give us a sequence of events with which we might make sense of what's happening in the period after 400. It's not unproblematic. Gildas is allergic to dates. He has practically no dates in his text, which means that it's almost impossible for historians to convincingly mesh his account with external events. It floats free, has its own internal sense of reference. That may in itself speak to Gildas's attempt to produce a timeless work that presents immutable truths, but it also speaks to perhaps his lack of knowledge of what's going on in the wider post-Roman world. Nevertheless, he gives us this sequence, and it's a sequence of episodes that collectively gives us a sense of the unraveling of Roman Britain. And in terms of understanding Gildas, I can do no better than to present to you the words of Claire Stancliffe, a prominent scholar of this period, in her assessment of Gildas and his enterprise. She writes, "For the modern historian, Gildas's account of British history is frustratingly oblique. There are few proper nouns from Britain in the work. For the sub-Roman period before his own lifetime, only 2 people and 1 place are mentioned. Yet scholars have picked over every word, since De Excidio remains by far the longest remotely contemporary source for the Britain of the late 5th and early 6th century, which witnessed the momentous Adventus Saxonum, the coming of the Saxons. That Gildas's sequence of events is defective is clear from, for instance, his ascription of the building of Hadrian's Wall to the era after the formal withdrawal of the Romans, when he says, they returned at the request of the British to help them against marauding Picts and Scots. His narrative continues with a further appeal to the Roman commander Agetius, who, largely because Gildas says he was addressed as thrice consul, has been identified with the Emperor Valentinian III's general Aetius, who was killed in 454. The appeal was rejected, but the Britons attained some success on their own, which won them a period of peace and, according to Gildas, luxury. There then followed a plague and the rumour of a renewed attack from the Picts, which the British countered with an invitation to the Saxons to come to their aid. After a long time, the Saxons, settled in the east of Britain, complained that the supplies they'd been granted were insufficient, and then they plundered the whole island. The British recovered, and under the leadership of Ambrosius Aurelianus, defeated the Saxons in battle. From then on, victory went now to the British, now to their enemies, until the British won nearly the last defeat of the villains, and certainly not the least, at Mons Badonicus, Mount Badon, in the year that Gildas himself was born. And Gildas tells us, in a rare engagement with concrete dating, it was 43 years and 1 month since the Battle of Mons Badonicus, and that was his age at the time he wrote this text. I talked earlier about the way in which medium and message can provide a compound set of insights into this period, and it's true with Gildas as well. His Latin, his frames of reference, his quotations, the kind of technical language he employs at various telling points in his often highly obscure narrative, all cast rare but significant light upon his education and his understanding of the world around him. I'm not going to dwell upon that. After all, some of the readings for this week address that issue explicitly. But I'm going to look at the message, the actual content, the narrative sequence he gives us, which is one in which the Romano-British have to deal with extensive attacks from Picts and Scots and have to organize their own defenses. So there's a devolution of power upon local figures. Eventually, the fateful axial decision is made once the request for further aid from Rome is denied, that if the British are going to survive, if they're going to have a chance to push back the peoples of the north and perhaps also the incomers from the west, then they need to bring in external armies to help them, which leads to the decision to invite the Saxons to come in and to supply them with food and materials by which they can work for the surviving Romano-British elites. Gildas's account, in its skeletal form, isn't entirely out of the frame of plausibility. After all, using barbarians against barbarians is one of the key strategies that the Romans have been using for several hundred years by this point. So it's an entirely plausible strategy that embattled oligarchs in some of the decaying Roman towns might decide to invite non-Roman peoples in and pay them in order to set them against other non-Romans in the hope that by so doing they may be able to ensure the survival of their own communities and whatever remains of this Romano-British mode of life. But the Saxons aren't the only element that's a problem for Gildas. There's also the question of these tyrants. So we have two different zones, if you like, two different spheres of concern for Gildas. The first is the way in which the Saxons, first invited in as Confederate troops to defend what remains of Roman Britain, have then turned against their patrons and attempted to carve out their own territories. The second is the presence of these Brittonic, these Celtic tyrants, who are also a cause for concern, particularly in their immorality and their misbehavior. So Gildas has multiple targets in his sights. Saxons, tyrants. How do we make sense of this? Well, here's the answer. Think back to the highland and the lowland zones. Think back to the shape of Roman Britain. Think back to the areas that were full of villas and were connected quite closely to the larger rhythms of Roman life. And then think about the areas that were occupied, in which the indigenous Celtic peoples were only tangentially integrated into any kind of Roman enterprise through trade and occasional exchanges, but for the most part were never Romanized, Romanitas, never grafted. If you think about those two zones, occupation and colonized spaces, we can start to understand why we have two distinct narratives knotting together in Gildas's weird text, because we have the lowland zone, in which Saxons are brought in as federate troops, very much in accord with what you'd see elsewhere in the Roman world. And then we have the tyrants, who invariably come from areas of occupation, areas that were highland, areas that were never fully integrated, and from which new political units have developed. So we have Constantine of Dumnonia down here in the southwest. We've got Aurelius Caninus, possibly round about here, and with more certainty, Vortapor of the Demotai, out here on that far southwestern tip. And then Cuneglassus of Dunearth over here. And Maglacunas, the dragon, on the island of Mona, the island of Anglesey, the island where, when Caesar arrived centuries before, they found the stronghold of the Druids. So the areas that are marginal, the areas that were never fully integrated into the Roman world, the areas that were occupied, all these places become the zones in which we see the emergence of Celtic, non-Roman leaders. You might come away from a consideration of the written sources for the period 400 to 600 with the sense that it's a little bit like trying to make a jigsaw, which has 1,000 pieces when you've only got 24. But you still need to get a sense of what the jigsaw is actually of. For a long time, that was the challenge that everybody faced. But in the 21st century, we can offset this textual narrative approach with that of archaeology and the study of material remains. So we can construct an alternative narrative and sequence of what's going on from 400 to 600 that doesn't derive or rest upon those narratives provided by Gildas or anybody else, but rather floats free. And then the challenge is to bring that into conversation meaningfully with what we can get out of the text. So in the next lecture, I'm going to move from texts to material objects and talk about what the archaeology can tell us about these years. And then we'll be in a place to bring them into conversation and to actually find out perhaps something of what really went on.